So welcome everyone. So Jonathan graduated from Syracuse a couple years ago. He kind of focused on a lot of different things while he was in school and in production and post-production and even journalism for a hot minute. And so since he graduated, he's been focusing on cinematography. So tonight he is here to talk about the anamorphic look and explain a couple things about why I don't like people to create a fake anamorphic look when they don't know what they're doing with the lenses. So he can explain a little bit about that while he is talking about everything he loves about anamorphic look. So I will turn it over to you, Jonathan.
Thank you. It's more of everything I love and hate about anamorphics, but we'll go from there. All right, let's start. All right, so thank you, Shayna, for introducing me. So today I'm going to be talking about anamorphics and how they are being used in Hollywood, how they work, the history about them, and some other technical stuff. So let's begin. All right, so starting off with anamorphics, as you could have seen in the definition there, it's basically anamorphic basically means squeezing an image. And so let's move into it. Let's talk briefly about the history of anamorphics. Anamorphics were first invented during World War II for tank crews. They were used to give tank crews a wider field of view because tanks are enclosed and they needed that wider field of view for their awareness. And the initial anamorphics were called hypergonars, and they provided about 180 degrees field of view. And the first cinematic use of anamorphics were back in 1927, and it was first used in a short film called To Build a Fire. And after World War II, in 1957, 20th Century Fox bought the rights to the technique and created what was back then known as CinemaScope. And right now you'll see.
It is my privilege to address you as one of the thousands of employees of 20th Century Fox. 1 year ago, we launched the first CinemaScope demonstration. In 1 short year, the trademark CinemaScope has become a symbol of something new and something better in the art of entertainment.
So when CinemaScope was introduced, it was mainly introduced because of the television boom. Television was coming into the field. A lot of people were buying television, and not a lot of people were going to the cinema. And so executive at Fox thought, well, if we provided theater goers with something that's different from a TV experience, that'll bring more audiences in to the theaters. So anamorphics, the first CinemaScope technique, was introduced to create a wider field of view within theaters, specifically a whopping 2.39 by 1 aspect ratio. And it was meant to closely mimic the human vision, which is, as you know, wider laterally. And Hollywood loved it for the way it mimicked human vision, human peripheral, as well as the artifacts and imperfections that it created, and were perceived as pleasing and beautiful to the general audience. And anamorphics these days are now used to convey a grand cinematic feeling. And while it may not be ideal in replicating grounded reality, as in The Social Network and etc., it can also be used to create a tone of epicness, grandness, beauty, and marvel. So let's, enough about the history. Let's move into the technical stuff. Let's first talk about squeeze factors. So what is squeeze factor? Basically, what anamorphic basically does is it compresses an image horizontally or laterally, as speak. And so there are different squeeze factors. The most common squeeze factors are 1.33, which is mainly used, which came as digital sensors came into the market. And there's also 2 times anamorphic, which is the more traditional anamorphic squeeze. So this is an example of a 1.33 squeeze ratio. And then this is a 2 times anamorphic squeeze. So as you can see, there will be a comparison coming out soon. As you can see, 1.33, 2 times, obviously the squeeze factor is different, how much it is being compressed laterally. Now, there are other squeeze factors as well. The most common is 2 times, which is used in Hollywood. But there's also 1.25, which is very subtle. And there's also 1.6. And there is a bunch of squeeze factors in between. Now let's move on to the main charm of anamorphic lenses, which are the imperfections. Let's begin with bokeh. So bokeh is what is considered the out of focus area in a picture. It originates from the Japanese word bubbles, and these often define the look of an image. So from here, you can see this is shot on a spherical lens, and spherical lenses have a circular bokeh. And that is mainly because the light is unmodified when entering the medium. However, this is an anamorphic bokeh, and anamorphic squeezes the light laterally entering the medium. And it usually creates these oval, top to bottom stretched bokeh bubbles. And a lot of people think that oval bokeh is caused by the oval looking iris of anamorphic lenses. However, this is not true. As you can see here, the oval looking iris is actually caused by the lens squeezing an image, and it does not mean that the shape of the iris is affected. And you can see an example here of a 2 times anamorphic lens of the oval looking iris. The main reason why anamorphic lenses have oval bokeh is because of the difference in the focal length that it has. Essentially, anamorphic lenses have 2 different focal lengths. Since it is squeezing the image laterally, the focal length horizontally tends to be a lot wider than the vertical. And what this means is that, say, if you have a 50 millimeter spherical lens and you put on a 2 times anamorphic on it, basically what it means is that a 50 millimeter anamorphic, a 2 times anamorphic lens will have a 50 millimeter focal length vertically. However, it'll have a 25 millimeter equivalent focal length horizontally, since it is much wider. And this difference in focal length means the out of focus backgrounds are affected differently. And since they are affected differently, the wider focal length, the horizontal focal length, will have less blur, less out of focus range, less out of focusness than the vertical, which creates these oval bokehs. However, this does not necessarily mean that they always produce oval bokehs that stretch up and down. Sometimes, if they are misaligned, they'll create bokehs that stretch sideways. And this characteristic of an anamorphic lens creates these beautiful, pleasing bokeh in the background and the foreground that almost looks painterly and almost waterfall-like. Now, let's start moving on to flares, which is probably the most distinctive part of an anamorphic lens and is also considered a dead giveaway, but is it really? It is considered very cinematic that even video games replicate it. And anamorphic lenses tend to have these horizontal streaking flares. Here's an example of a video game which has horizontal streaking anamorphic flares, and another video game, which actually doesn't make sense because it's through an eye of a character. But basically, why anamorphic lenses cause the horizontally streaking flare is not that it stretches the light out in a horizontal way. Rather, it's the internal reflections of a bright source of light. And basically, it's a bokeh bubble that's stretched out exponentially horizontally and sometimes vertically as well. And as you can see in the example, you can see there are horizontally stretched bokeh bubbles of the reflection of the flashlight. And these are what causes the horizontal looking flares. And as you can see from this example, these flares often replicate the look of an iris. So from this example, you can see a kind of hexagonal shape, and the hexagonal shapes that are basically squished and stretched out vertically, horizontally. Second distortion I want to talk about is the barrel and pincushion distortions. These are mostly weeded out in modern anamorphic lenses, but for older models, since they have elements that are considered imperfect, they create these barrel distortion, which is basically where it is kind of like bulging in the middle, and creates these outside facing curvatures on the sides and the top. And also pincushion distortions, which are the opposite. Basically, it's as if somebody's like, it's pushed in the middle and all the curves are going inwards. Pincushion distortions are less prominent, more common than barrel distortions, but it's still present. There's also the differing squeeze factors within an element itself. So some anamorphics with their imperfect lens elements will have more squeeze as you go towards the edges of the frame, which creates these more weird looking images on the sides. Now to fall off. Fall off basically means the difference with focus within an image. So anamorphics will have fall off on the edges, which means it'll lose focus as it reaches the edges. And this could be either top, bottom, or the sides. And these are caused when the lens elements are not perfect. And these can be either being out of focus areas or chromatic aberrations. Now on to asymmetrical breathing. Breathing is basically when a lens element zooms in and out as somebody is pulling focus. And this is more or less common in all lenses. And a lot of cinema gear makers will use techniques to combat this. But it's because of how light works. When you move elements within a lens, it'll create minor focal changes, which causes the image to zoom in and out. However, like I mentioned before, since anamorphics have different focal lengths moving horizontally and vertically, these create something called asymmetrical breathing, which means that the horizontal breathing will be more severe than the vertical breathing. And it creates where it looks like the image is being more squished and more spread out as you're pulling focus. Now moving on to softness. Anamorphic lenses tend to be very soft, and many people consider this as a characteristic of anamorphic lenses, and people consider it a pleasing aspect of using an anamorphic lens. And for a digital era, this means that a lot of the sharp, clean digital images will look more cinematic and more smooth, more soft and more pleasing to the eye. And and oftentimes this could also mean that it's kind of hard to focus on something because it won't produce an image that is super sharp. And this softness and honestly, this everything, all the elements, most of the imperfections that an anamorphic lens has stems from something called astigmatism. Basically, when an anamorphic element is placed, the light is directed in a certain pattern due to the difference in the horizontal and vertical squeeze. And what this causes is it causes an astigmatation. What causes something called astigmatism, which is basically a misalignment of the focus between horizontal and the vertical. So you're trying to focus the horizontal, but then the vertical is being offset, and your image will never look as sharp or in
A
focus.
cylindrical element.
So let's move on to downsides of anamorphic lenses. And this kind of continues from the idea of astigmatism, the issue of astigmatism and how the astigmatism causes certain downsides of using an anamorphic lens. Let's first focus on how anamorphic lenses are
A
focused.
cylindrical element has to rotate by 180 degrees to have the same effect. This is why an anamorphic block and the elements within it have to be fine-tuned to align to each other and the spherical lens. To focus a spherical lens, you can move the whole lens back and forth. Or you can just move the relevant elements while the rare elements stay in place. With anamorphic, to get a sharp image, you need to make sure that there's no astigmatism. If you only move your spherical elements and keep the cylinders untouched, you will always get astigmatism and no sharp image at all. Focus cannot be achieved by moving the whole system back and forth anymore. The simplest way to focus is to move the spherical block as usual and to focus the anamorphic block separately. This method is called double focus.
I want to quickly talk about double focus, as it is probably the most common way of focusing an anamorphic lens that is not made as an anamorphic lens. So let me stop sharing for a brief moment. So this is basically what's called an anamorphic adapter. It squeezes an image, and the only purpose of this this adapter is just to squeeze an image. So how you use this is you attach it to a regular spherical lens, and it creates an anamorphic image. It squeezes the lens element, the lens image together to create an anamorphic image. The problem with this is, as mentioned in the video, you can only focus this by focusing both rings in order to get rid of the astigmatism. So you'll have to focus with one ring, and then you'll have to clean up the image with the other focus system. And this would not be practical in a cinematography setting, as when a subject's moving, you're going to have to constantly work two focus gears to keep a subject in focus.
There are cine lenses that work in exactly the same way, but they have one focus ring. They simply couple the focus systems mechanically. Movements of the spherical block back and forth and movement of the cylinders closer and further. This method is called mechanical synchro. The original CinemaScope lenses built by Bausch & Lomb used this method. Mechanical synchro has its downside. As your cylinders move closer for close focus, they lose potency and generate less squeeze. Sometimes a 2x lens will become a 1.7x lens at 1 meter close focus, and manufacturers will limit close focus there because generally the closer you go, the more squeeze you lose. In the old days this was a problem because the de-squeeze during projection was fixed at 2x while the squeeze during acquisition varied. Close-up shot of actors looked like their faces were swollen, which is why the phenomenon was called anamorphic mumps.
Now I'll talk about anamorphic mumps. This is basically what it is. So with this focusing method, when a subject is closer to lens, the lens itself loses the squeezing potency. So the subject will be, since you're squeezing the image, but the image itself isn't as squeezed, you end up with subjects that look like they have swollen faces. And these are what's considered as anamorphic mumps. And this is a specific downside of using a certain type of anamorphic lenses that uses this type of focusing.
Panavision has its own method. As we mentioned before, it was key ingredient to their success over Bausch & Lomb designs. The anamorphic block is fixed, while the spherical block moves behind it. Two lower power anamorphic elements are added between the two blocks or inside the anamorphic block. They are rotated so their effect cancels itself out. When focusing the spherical block, the lower power elements are rotated in the opposite directions, focusing the anamorphic block without losing squeeze. Now you get a constant 2x squeeze. For this reason, they are called the counter-rotating astigmatizers. While the optical design is by Wallin, this focus method is named after Panavision's founder and lead engineer as the Gottschalk method. It is said that the first Panavision lenses are Bausch & Lomb CinemaScope Baltars with this mechanism inserted into them. Simpler and easier to service is the method used by Todd A.O. The principle is similar to the ones used by Panavision. The spherical block moves while the anamorphic block stays in place. Inside the anamorphic block is a group to correct astigmatism, and this group moves back and forth. While the mechanisms are simple, there are still a lot of moving parts. Using variable diopters is a simple and elegant concept. The spherical block is fixed to infinity focus. The anamorphic block is also fixed to infinity focus, and they never move. In front of the system, two more spherical lenses are added. These two elements cancel each other out when they are very close. But as you start spacing them apart, they introduce dioptric power to the system, shifting your focus closer and closer. That's why they are called variable diopters. This is used in Vantage Hawks, Coke Anamorphics, Atlas Orions, Technovisions, Cineovisions, Lomo Roundfronts, and others. Downsides are the size and weight, as they need to be large to avoid vignetting, which they still tend to do.
Speaking of the variable diopter approach, this is one of those type of lenses. And basically what it is it's a projector, as an anamorphic projector lens with a regular spherical lens. So anamorphic element, spherical element, and then a variable diopter. So this thing is the one that focuses. So you don't use any other focus gears on the lenses. This is the only gear that focuses the lens. And basically what a diopter is it's considered a magnifying glass for your camera. Basically you have two magnifying elements together. You put them together, they lose their magnification. You spread them apart, you gain magnification. So basically you're moving the focal plane by moving those two elements further apart or together. Another downside of using anamorphic lenses is the focusing distance. Because of how the focus gears work, anamorphics usually have a minimum of maybe 3 feet minimum focusing distance to about 10 feet for larger format anamorphic lenses. This means that you're going to need those diopters to focus any closer than 3 feet. And diopters don't really extend your focus range. It's rather moving your focus range closer so that you can focus on subjects closer to the camera. So once you put on a diopter, you'll no longer be able to focus on infinity because you're basically moving your focus distance. So some examples of using diopters for cinematic use. This obviously was shot a lot close using an anamorphic lens. And still using diopters, you're still going to get astigmatism and other problems, other issues of focusing too close with an anamorphic lens. As you can see here, this is supposed to be perfectly in focus, yet you still see that sideways stretch, that astigmatism appear. There are other downsides of using anamorphic lenses. Obviously, the first one is the size and weight. Anamorphic lenses, as you saw in the example before, have a lot of elements in them, and they are oftentimes very heavy, very bulky, and very expensive as well. Other common issue is misalignment. Since the anamorphic blocks have to be perfectly aligned with the sensor. If you if you shoot it maybe a little turned or tilted, you're going to end up with an image that is basically slanted, and there's very little you can do to fix that. And also there are issues of the streaks going diagonally, and when you're shooting anamorphic, you always have to keep your horizon. You can't fix it in post because of all the streaks and all the stretch and elements that you have. And also there's also an issue of lens speed. Anamorphic lenses, since they are so soft, they tend to be no faster than maybe 2.8, f2.8 or f4. And if you go, there are lenses that go faster, but then you're going to end up with astigmatism and softness that is virtually unusable. Now I'm going to talk about issues of using anamorphics in the modern digital media. So a regular film plane is 4:3. That's how it used to be for a long time. And most modern photo cameras also use a 4:3 sensors. And 4:3 sensors basically are what anamorphic, 2x anamorphics were made for, because they create the 2.39 aspect ratio. But then modern age came and they introduced the HD sensor side, which is 16:9. And consider this, 16:9, when you squeeze a 16:9 sensor by 2x, you end up with 32:9 image, which, let me show you an example. This is 2.39 by 1 aspect ratio. And this is what the digital sensor with a 16:9 sensor captures when it's squeezed by 2x. So basically, it is in a format that is too slim to be usable. And if you crop that down to a 2.39 by 1 aspect ratio, you lose a lot of the information on the sides. And that's one of the downsides of using a modern digital camera with either a Super 35 sensor or any sensors that are 16:9, which is the most common sensor size. And you end up losing a lot of information on the side, which is the exact opposite of what anamorphics were initially made for, which is to retain as much information as you can in a film plane. Now let's move on to anamorphics, or so-called anamorphoses. This is an anamorphic lens. Basically, it's a spherical lens with an oval-shaped iris in it, and also a thin wire, preferably a fishing line, which is transparent in it. And what this does is it basically limits the lights that are coming into the iris, and basically creates what looks like an anamorphic image without the downsides of an anamorphic. So even a regular lens like this, a Sigma 18-35, there are attachments for it, basically plastic masks that you can put onto your lens element that creates an anamorphic bokeh. And the fishing line is there to create the horizontal streaks. Basically, if you put a fishing line, a transparent fishing line closer to the sensor, it goes out of focus and basically streaks the light, any light that's hitting it. And these can mimic the horizontal flaring that anamorphic lenses have. And there are also filters. There are also streak filters that can do this, which goes on front of the lens element. And there are also oval bokeh masks and anamorphic masks that you can put on front of the anamorphic lenses to create the same effect. And what this effect is this. You have the horizontal flaring, you also have the oval bokeh, you have that waterfall, like the painterly bokeh out of focus backgrounds, and you have no issues with the minimum focusing distance. You don't lose any data, but obviously if you're going to crop the image to create that widescreen aspect ratio, you're going to lose some information, but you have minimal downsides, yet have the most preferred aspects of an anamorphic lens, other than the barrel distortion and etc. And as you can see, it's very similar. It's very convincing, and it's very easy to use. However, there are some.
Now, there's also
downsides
ways to
using
fake the
anamorphic.
anamorphic look. For example, this is a True Streak blue filter made by Schneider. See, if you take a close look at it, you can see those blue lines going through there, but it disappears as soon as you put it up to the lens. Actually, right now you can kind of see it still, which is not good. Probably because we're all the way at a 16, but once you zoom in, they just kind of disappear. If you take a light and shine it, see that? But one thing you also have to watch out for is that you don't want to rotate it the wrong way. You need it perfectly on there. I used this on a project a while back, and I didn't really love it because it just tends to flare too easily. For example, if there's a blown out window, this anamorphic lens would kind of maintain that flare, but this just makes everything just go crazy.
And there's also issues of the fishing line being visible in the bokeh in the background. And this is inevitable. I mean, if you don't want this, you're gonna have to remove the fishing line. But even Hollywood uses anamorphics. This is a scene from John Wick, which actually used anamorphic lenses, but it didn't flare as much as they wanted. So they basically added a streak filter in front of it to create anamorphic lenses and anamorphic effects. Or you can go the David Fincher route and just do everything in post. So, like Mindhunter, was shot on a spherical and they just added everything in post. So that's all I have for anamorphics. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk. Thank you.
Right, talk about the post-production issues.
Oh, post-production issues. Okay, I'll dive into that. So, like I mentioned, anamorphics have a bunch of distortion. Like, you have the barrel distortion, the pincushion distortion, you have the oval bokeh, you have the flaring, you have the fall off, you have a bunch of different squeeze factors, everything. So it becomes especially difficult in post to, for example, add VFX into it. That's one of the reasons why Blade Runner didn't use anamorphics. They used anamorphics for the most of what they shot, but for the scenes that required VFX, they went with a spherical. And you can see it in examples that I'm going to show you right now. Is it visible? Shayna, can you see it?
Yeah, we can see your image, your
Okay.
video.
Yeah. So this scene, obviously it's a VFX shot. It was shot on a spherical. And the other scenes like this were shot on anamorphics because they didn't really require any VFX work. And those are kind of the issues that you run into when you use a VFX lens, when you use an anamorphic lens on a VFX project. It is very hard to replicate these kind of distortion and imperfections of an anamorphic lens on your VFX work. And also adding say, I want to go back to the battlefield footage that I had. Like this to a trained eye doesn't make sense. Not because it's from a person's perspective, but you're having horizontal anamorphic streaks along with spherical lens flares. So you're having both anamorphic flaring and spherical flaring, which doesn't make sense. And a lot of student projects I've seen have this problem where they'll add, VFX flares to their projects, which were shot on a spherical. And, it's obvious that they shot it on a spherical, but you have those horizontal streaking flares that essentially doesn't contribute to the story or the visual expression, I should say. So there we go. Any
Yeah,
questions?
Yeah.
I think that covers it. Yeah, so like I've had a really difficult time. I forgot, Eric, if you were working on this with me, but there was a film that shot digital anamorphic. And you want to stop screen sharing, Jonathan?
Not bad.
And it had a pan, so basically a 360 pan. So they put a camera on a tripod in the middle of a room and then kind of spun it around so you could see the whole thing. And there was a monitor that was during that pan. And we had to replace the image on the monitor. And so when it's in the center of the frame, it looks like an HD monitor. And then as it gets towards the edges, it starts stretching really badly on one corner of it, but staying normal here. And then eventually, so it was never going to look right because it was doing the same thing that Jonathan was talking about, that it's like bulging and doing that kind of stuff. Plus, it's got a vignette on the edges. So there's that.
There's a lot of problems when trying to composite using on an anamorphic image because of all the distortion and imperfections that it has, like the varying squeeze rates, like Shayna talked about, and the flaring, the vignetting, and the barrel distortion, the pincushion distortion. It's really hard to match any element on top of an anamorphic image, and
And what I was told after the fact was they didn't balance the camera properly on the tripod. So it wasn't even set right that you could get the right kind of look to it if you did it mathematically. So delightful.
thank you, everyone. Any questions? I'm not an expert, but I can,
You get it,
Eric, I
Eric.
love it. Nice, Luke. Yeah.
Yeah.
Perfect. There you go. Yeah. Now it makes sense.
The
Mine's
other
real,
thing I
though.
want to say for VFX work is every other format that you have, you get extra room that's going to be cut off in the letterbox to do your VFX with. And anamorphic, you really don't. The only parts of the anamorphic frame that you're not going to use are slivers at the top and bottom, which, as you just heard, are out of focus, and on the sides that get cropped. So the vignetting gets cropped. So they're unusable anyway. But every other format that you shoot in, besides HD, you get all this extra room that you can resize and reposition and do a lot of, you have a lot more freedom in visual effects with other formats.
Yeah, I want to add on to that. Like I was talking about, I also talked about the softness that anamorphics had. Anamorphics are really unforgiving when you shoot it the wrong way. So for example, if you shoot a spherical, if you shot it a little tilted, if your tripod was unleveled, you can always rotate it in post and kind of like reframe it. Anamorphics, you can't do that because once you rotate it, you basically ruin all the flares and the leveling that it's supposed to have. And also when you crop in zoom into an anamorphic image, because of the softness, it becomes very fast becomes unusable because of all the softness that you have. And you have very little leeway in post to reframe the image because it already comes out all squished and, just framed the way it was shot.
This is where generational gaps happen, like break wide open. I'm like listening to all this. I'm like, wait a minute, you guys are sounding like you're poo-pooing on Anamorphic, which is like mind-blowing, because from my particular lens as a cinematographer, Anamorphic is pure magic because of everything that you're saying. The idea that it doesn't look like normal life. It doesn't look like 90% of the stuff that's made spherical. It does require you to light, that you can't just go out and shoot natural lighting conditions. You actually have to think about what you're doing before you do it. You actually have to plan accordingly and like bring craftsmanship and artistry and technical proficiency to make something amazing. And I think the way that spherical and digital has made a lot of these things easy and punted things to post has sort of damaged a little bit of the visual artistry that the demands of something like Anamorphic historically has placed upon the image maker. So I feel like back in my day, this is what we did and we liked it. Like I'm feeling a little old, but I love Anamorphic. I love the, I think all of the deficiencies are actually would make it magical and special. So let's not lose sight of that.
Absolutely. I mean, I totally agree. I mean, I love anamorphics. That's why I made my own, use my own, and one day I dream of using the Airy anamorphics.
And those you won't nearly see nearly as much of these problems like as the optical engineering the tech, the brain trust increases and you get your hands on bigger tools, these other issues to start to
absolutely
away.
I feel also, like
I was going to say, I'd recommend you guys check out a film shot by Rachel Morrison called Confirmation. In that film, they actually shot anamorphic, but did a 16:9 extraction from the center of that field. So I think at the time, HBO was only taking 16:9 deliveries, but they still wanted to get the surreal feeling that an anamorphic would give, particularly in the out of focus elements. And so that was sort of like a very creative way to get the best of both worlds.
I feel like the visual beauty that anamorphics provide outweigh the downsides of using them. So, but to each their own.
Replacement, right, Sheena?
We just charge more money for it.
Yeah. To each their own, because I know like
do whatever you want. I get more money.
I know what was it? I forgot his name. 1917, the cinematographer behind that.
Roger Deakins.
Roger Deakins. Yeah, Roger Deakins never uses anamorphics. He always uses spherical, and that's mainly because of his background as a documentary person. He wants to capture reality as is, the image as is, rather than make it more beautiful and spicing it up using the lens.
Each have their place, just depends on the project.
Exactly. Yeah. Like I say David Fincher used anamorphics on Social Network. I would say that doesn't really fit the tone. And
not at all. I agree with that.
Yeah.
Especially
in
on
the
a
history
red.
lesson, you should have included what the origin of the word anamorphic came from.
Say that again.
In your little history lesson at the beginning, I'm surprised you didn't include the definition of anamorphic, like where it comes from. Because I learned that it comes from the word anamorphosis.
Right. Yeah.
Which stands for to form again, which kind of makes sense because you're deforming and reforming an image.
Mm-hmm.
So not the popular book series Animorphs.
That's what I was gonna say.
Yeah, it's like
Cool. Does anyone else have any questions?
Yeah,
Comments?
Jonathan, do you have any suggestions for those like blue streak filters, like just like fun? I mean, they seem reasonably affordable and cheap to get some kind of play around with kind of stuff. Are there any you recommend?
I mean, I've tried a couple. The thing about a lot of the streak filters that are sold are they have a lot of lines going through them. And what you end up with is bokehs that have a lot of
Yeah.
lines in them, which is kind of be distracting. So I mostly use like the Anamorphic lens that I showed an example of in the video. This is made by Iron Glass, which is a Ukrainian company. And they basically integrate the anamorphic elements in the lens itself. So it creates the bokeh, and it only has a single fishing line that creates the flares. So I'd say go with a dedicated anamorphic, but or you can do it in post, yeah.
Yep, always.
Yeah, that's why like for the Sigma that I have, this is basically a 3D printed piece that goes on the back using screws that are already on the lens. And I don't have a fishing line on it because I'd rather do that in post because it's hard to replicate the anamorphic bokeh in post. So I'd rather get that using the lens and do the flares afterwards.
Yeah, that's what I was specifically thinking is to get the bokeh look and then do the flares with like Red Giant or something. Cool.
I've even done it by cutting out a piece of gaff tape and just like sticking it onto the back of the lens. It works.
Love it.
Jackson, what is that?
They just make little like filters and stuff, basically what Brad was asking.
Sweet, thanks, Jackson.
Yeah, one thing to be warned about for those kind of like front anamorphic adapters is that if you have any lenses that are wide, it'll like show, it'll vignette, and you know, if you stop down, they'll be super prevalent. So you might have to consider that.
They sell some that do both. They sell like this weird one that you can put on the back, and then also some of the front ones.
Yeah, I always prefer the ones that you can put on the back because the closer to the sensor, the more out of focus it is. So it's less of a hassle.
I was going to recommend also, if you guys are interested in like more of this, there's a whole series of videos made by this YouTuber called the Anamorphic Cookbook. That's really worth checking out. It's like a series of like 8 20-minute videos that go.
That's how I got started on Anamorphic. So just watching his videos.
Yeah, he's a good channel.
Yeah. That and a lot of the sample images, sample videos that I used on my presentation were from a channel called Media Division. They have an amazing video on anamorphics and different selection of lenses. So I also recommend that as well.
Cool. Well, thank you, Jonathan. That was very good. Yay. Silent clapping.